Welcome to the Delaware SBDC interview series, Considering Throwing in the Towel, Reflections for Small Businesses. If your business was adversely impacted and you are considering your options, this series of interviews will provide you with valuable information. In this third interview, we speak with Rick Harman and Maria Clyde about employee separation and layoffs, family leave laws, and safety concerns.
Thank you for joining us for video 3 of our interview series. My name is Anthony George. I'm a business advisor at the Delaware Small Business Development Center. At the SBDC, we deliver training and free professional consulting services to help startups and existing small businesses formulate and execute strategies to grow and succeed. I'm developing this interview series to provide practical advice to small businesses adversely impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm happy to introduce today's experts, Maria Clyde and Rick Harman. Maria is the Director of Human Resources at B&H Insurance, formerly Bramhall and Hitchin, where she handles HR for the agency and serves as an HR consultant for their many insurance clients. Rick is the Managing Principal of Acute Consulting, a boutique human resources consultancy. He works with companies of all sizes, providing human capital, executive search, and total rewards consulting. He's also a mentor for the University of Delaware's Horn program. Thank you for joining us, Maria and Rick. I want to start with our first question, but before I begin, I'm going to discuss how we structured today's interview. I've divided the questions into 4 sections. The first section will focus on companies that are in distress and are looking to close their business. The second section will focus on companies that are in distress but are examining their strategic options, i.e. they may or may not close their business. The third section will discuss companies that are impacted by the pandemic but are keeping their doors open and remaining in business. And the last section will talk about some special considerations for large employers. So Rick, I'm going to start with you to discuss the first section, the companies that are in distress and are planning to close their doors. My first question is, if you know definitively you are closing your doors, what are some recommendations for handling employee relations?
Yeah, so it's a great place to start. And first of all, thank you, Anthony, for having me on today. And hi, Maria, it's my partner. It's great to see you again. I think the most basic principle is it's a very difficult situation. So to remain human and humble at all times is really important. As a leader and a small business owner, ensuring that you kind of set the tone at the top without creating a panic within your organization is extremely important. Communication, I'd err on the side of over communicating to your employees, again, without creating a panic, to make sure that they understand kind of what's going on, why it's happening, and then ultimately maybe what's going to happen to them in their future at the organization as well. Treat everyone, the most important thing is probably just to treat everyone fairly, equitably. A lot of small businesses, you have individuals that you've worked with for years and years, and they're kind of part of your extended family. So it's really important that you make sure they understand that you have their considerations and their thoughts, and you're empathetic. You have their thoughts in mind when you're going through some types of actions, whether it's closing your doors ultimately or even scaling down the business. So just remember to remain, everyone's a human being, and treat them the most respectful way possible, I think is a great way to kind of manage through a difficult situation.
Okay. My next question is, how can an employer provide a soft landing for employees?
Yes, that's another great question. So this one was high on my list, having gone through this at another larger organization in an HR leadership role. I think anything you can do to help your employees, especially in small businesses, is extremely important. So if you have the means and the ability and you have a great network, leverage your network to hopefully, if you're closing your doors, be able to help individuals place in another role, next opportunity, or at least make connections for them. Open up your network, make introductions. I think it goes a long way to your employees and knowing that you're kind of taking care of them as much as possible, and helping them find their next path, right? Whatever that may be, while you're also exiting them in the most appropriate way possible. And again, being a human, treating them like human beings with feelings and emotions, and just understanding from their perspective where they may be in their career journey, in their personal journeys, and just ensuring that if you are in a position to be able to help them as a leader, then try to do that. And I think that's really simple for a lot of folks today, just by opening up their network and making connections for them locally.
Okay, and then the last question for this section is, what are some practical considerations for separation?
Yeah, so a lot of tactical things as you go through separation, whether it's small business to mid-sized to large corporates. Just ensuring that you have all of your equipment back and things like ID cards, or if there's a corporate credit card, company cars, laptops, data, information, things that you're going to want to have, that you place a high sense of sensitivity around and priority around as a business owner, ensuring that you collect all that information, that you have it in-house, and that there's a nice even exchange between you and your employees that are leaving the organization, to ensure that you capture whatever is your company property to reduce risk and mitigate any type of information leaving the organization. Again, it could be corporate credit cards, badges, IDs, you name it, laptops, cell phones, closing out their employee records, making sure that payroll is correct and complete for them at the time that they're going to leave. If there's any vacation pay that they need to be paid out, make sure that you have a really tight connection with your payroll department and finance to ensure that those things are done correctly and cleanly on the way out, so you don't have to have employees coming back to you with errors or corrections. It becomes an administrative nightmare. So make sure that's really buttoned up and in place before employees exit the organization, or as they're exiting the organization.
Okay. In the next section, I want to talk about companies that are in distress, but they're still examining their strategic options. They're not sure if they're going to close or remain open. My first question is, what are some compensation reduction recommendations?
Yeah, so another great question. I think as a lot of you have read too, whether it's small business or large businesses, companies have been furloughing through COVID. That's an opportunity or an option. If you're in a position where you're in distress and you're undecided whether you're going to shut down or not, or close your doors, what you want to do from a comp and benefits perspective is minimize and mitigate the costs that you're carrying on your book. So there are a number of ways to do it. One, I would stop with any types of promotions that are in place, especially if you know that you're heading towards closure. Open roles, close out any open roles that you're actively recruiting on. Unfortunately, if there are people that you're going to onboard, if they aren't essential and critical to the business as it's closing its doors, or you're actually going through that process, you probably want to halt that as well. Pay increases, things like bonuses, unfortunately, come down to, again, it's a financial activity you have to go through. So in order to help with your accounting and your revenues, you're probably going to want to zero out bonuses, unfortunately, promotion pay increases. You may want to look at strategically things like reduced work hours, removing all overtime if you can. And again, if there's an opportunity for job sharing, or if it's a temporary furlough, then that's a good way to kind of reduce hourly expenses as well for hourly employees, or even for salaries for exempt employees. And as you'll see in the press, there's a lot of executives that have taken pay cuts at large corporations to help reduce compensation expense during COVID, and other employees as well have taken a halt in promotions, pay increases, bonuses, and reduced salaries to help get companies through a difficult time and onto the next stage. So they're all recommended approaches. And I don't think there's any one answer. I think you have to kind of go through what's best for you and your organization and do an assessment and figure out, of those options, what should I take action on?
Okay, I know you mentioned layoffs. Can you explain in more detail selection criteria when it comes to layoffs?
Yeah, so that's a good one. And it gets a little tricky. It depends on the size of the organization, but there are a number of ways that you can go through an assessment. So there's seniority-based, there's employee status-based assessments, performance, skills-based, competency-based, criticality for the organization, or it could be a combination of one or all of those things. Usually for small businesses, I think the general rule of thumb by the Society of Human Resource Management is if you're below 15 employees, when you're going through this process, there's really no need to look at an adverse impact analysis, because that's another thing you want to think about, so that you're not showing disparate treatment across different employee populations. So if you're north of 15 employees, it's probably something you may want to go through and have legal counsel go through, just to run a quick assessment of who are we going to select here and why, to be sure and mitigate your risk on disparate treatment of employees. If you're less than that, I generally think you're safe per the general guideline out there. So again, it could be a number of different factors. And again, it's another thing where you want to assess yourself as a business and how you want to do this. But there are a number of ways that you can do it, and you can select one or you can select all of them and apply them. My recommendation would be use the most cautious way you can and risk averted way you can, and go through the entire population from criticality and seniority and performance as well, so that you have a good story you can put together in terms of who are those individuals and why. And that's always going to be a better position than just kind of selecting names and putting them on a slate.
Okay. As I mentioned, when a company's still thinking about their strategic options, one of the things they're going to have to most likely do, especially if they're going to eventually sell the business or stay in business, is to retain critical staff. Do you have any recommendations or ideas on what companies can do to retain critical staff during this time?
Yeah, so it's a really important point. Retention bonuses come up a lot. You know, if you're in a position and you have the ability and you want to retain individuals, there are a number of ways that you can structure retention bonuses, but just the thought of a retention bonus and placing that out there to an employee that you find critical and need to retain is really important. I think a lot of times when employees hear that, they're kind of like, oh, that's great, retention, what are you talking about? And it's usually in the form of some type of delayed cash incentive that they're going to be paid in exchange for the work that you need them to do as a company's considering closing its doors. Having an open discussion with critical staff, making sure they know how important they are and why you need them to stay is really important. I think a lot of times we undervalue the verbal communication that we give to employees, and we're all human beings, so we love to hear kudos and nice things and acknowledgments. And if you're able to do that as a leader in a small business and just, again, verbally communicate to your essential employees and critical employees how important they are and why you want them to stay, sometimes that can go a long way before you even get to the point of needing to put a retention bonus in place.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
For the next section, we're going to talk about some questions around that are geared towards businesses that are impacted by the pandemic, but they are planning to remain open and remain in business. I'm going to turn things over to Maria for this section. For the first question, Maria, what are some considerations when you're asking a class of employees not to come to work?
Sure. This question has come up a lot lately in the HR world, and as a lot of the pivots that we've had to make given what the pandemic has thrown at us. So when you take these things into consideration, we're talking about a pandemic here. So we have medical considerations for our employees. There's the CDC has also determined that there are certain age categories that are sensitive and maybe more at risk, they've called it. So now you have the question of, okay, can I just tell all of my employees over a certain age threshold that no, that they shouldn't come to work and they should continue working remotely? The answer to this question, of course, is really governed by the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which applies to every employer with 15 or more employees. And then, of course, again, since we're dealing with a pandemic here, we have certain people's medical information. That information is governed by HIPAA, the Health Information Privacy Act. So these types of conversations with our employees are best had on an individual and private basis due to how sensitive some of the information can be. Everyone's situation is going to be different. So please remember, of course, that all medical information is private, meaning COVID status, what sort of underlying conditions people might have, ageism as well, what age people are. All of this information is technically private information. And when HR has these conversations with employees, if we're documenting these types of conversations, we need to make sure that all notes and everything relative to that is in fact kept private. And of course, in the personnel file, separate, because medical information should be kept separately. With that being said, with this whole should I require my employees to return to work or not, a lot of this is going to fall under the ADA, or Americans with Disabilities Act, because working remotely is technically considered a reasonable accommodation. So again, the answer to that is going to be have these conversations with your employees on an individual basis as to what would best fit their needs. You may not have any idea if the person has certain underlying medical conditions, if they live in a household with people with underlying medical conditions, whether that be parents that they're taking care of or children that they're taking care of. So there's so many nuances here that it's best not to have a blanket policy of everyone over X age has to work from home or has to do this. We do recommend that people have individual conversations when it comes to this.
Okay, thank you. My next question is if you can explain in more detail the Family First Coronavirus Response Act.
I'll try to keep this as brief as I possibly can because there has been so much information that's come out due to the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, FFCRA, as we've seen it throughout the news here. So this is a federal mandate, and technically this is an expansion and addition to FMLA, which is Family and Medical Leave Act. Again, a federal mandate. So what FFCRA does is it takes into consideration COVID and allowing certain employees to take paid leave or partially paid leave for COVID related reasons under this act. The other big difference for this is this applies to employers who have less than or 500 or less employees. And and this includes employers who have less than 50 employees, whereas regular FMLA, it only applies to employers who have 50 or more employees. So that's the first biggest thing. You can technically apply for an exemption under this if you're under 50 employees and it would jeopardize the business. However, the DOL hasn't been extremely clear on how to really apply for this exemption and whether or not it's going to be honored. So a lot of attorneys have said, okay, let's make sure that we are abiding by FFCRA and basically not denying people leave if they come to us for a qualified reason. So technically under FFCRA, we have two buckets and two different types of leave. And I try to take in both the letter of the law and the spirit of the law when we look at this mandate and when we look at this law. So the first part is going to be emergency paid sick leave. I'll cover that one first. That is an employer is obligated to pay an employee at full pay for qualifying reasons being out for COVID-19 if they are in fact sick or been told by a medical provider to quarantine or any other documented information that they have that they should quarantine. I know there's a lot of tracing apps out right now, and there's a lot going on with, say if someone has potentially been exposed to COVID-19, technically that would qualify the employee to be able to get emergency paid sick leave, and the employer would then have to pay the employee up to 80 hours of emergency paid sick leave at full pay for qualifying reasons. That is if they themselves are the ones subject to quarantine or are in fact sick. Then the other piece of this is if they are if they're taking care of someone else who may be sick or being a caretaker for somebody, then technically they would get to be paid 2/3 of their pay up to a certain max. The Federal Department of Labor has a very detailed question and answer section on their website for this. So I always tell my clients, go visit that site, search for the terms that you're looking for, because there's so many nuances in these situations that we want to make sure that we have the right scenario that they're eligible for, whether they're at full pay or 2/3 pay, and the fact that if we have the proper documentation for them. So first bucket, emergency paid sick leave. Second bucket is technically an expansion of FMLA, so extended FMLA, expanded family and medical leave at 2/3 the employee's rate of pay. And that's basically for an employee who needs to stay home to take care of their children due to their children's school or regular childcare being closed due to COVID-19. So again, this gets very complicated, but the basics is pretty much everyone who's 500 employees or less has to, is governed by FFCRA. Let's make sure of what their eligibility reasons are and that they are in fact eligible, and are they eligible for full pay or 2/3 pay. And then let's make sure that we're tracking this appropriately, because up to 12 weeks, it doesn't have to be 12 weeks. You don't have to just automatically give them 12 weeks. Maybe they only need 4, maybe they only need 6, but it's the fact that we're tracking all of this. But I do recommend you getting in touch with either an HR consultant or your attorney if someone comes to you and requests FFCRA and you're not sure if they qualify. And then the other thing I also suggest is that we document everything accordingly, meaning they have all the documentation from their medical provider or from their school, their children's school or daycare provider, just to make sure that when we grant them this, that it is for legitimate reasons.
Okay, thank you. My next question is, what do you do if an employee refuses to come to work due to fear of getting COVID-19?
This is definitely a tough one because, as I said in a couple of questions ago, a lot of these scenarios are going to be individual scenarios, right? So we have to talk to our employees about what it is going on that may be preventing them from coming to work. We need to try to understand the situation. If there's an underlying medical condition or a health reason, can we, instead of telling them, of course, you have to come back to work, you're required to do so, can we maybe make an accommodation for them to do remote work, or can we shift their job and have them do something else instead of reporting to a job? So again, trying to understand that situation is really, really important, and err on the side of being conservative, because we don't know what people are dealing with at home. Now, if the employee's job, the essential job functions, require them to technically come to work and there's no way that they can do their job at home, then we need to look and see if, due to the fact that we cannot reasonably accommodate them and they cannot fulfill their essential job functions, do we have to terminate? My point in all of this is we can't just jump to conclusions here and terminate employees that refuse to come to work without having a conversation with them and figuring out and getting to the bottom of what is the real reason. Technically, and we're trying to figure this out with unemployment and how they're doing this. If an employee is available to work, then they should come to work. And if their job is available for them and they refuse to take it, we could consider that to be a voluntary resignation at that point. Let's say we call them back from furlough, or we say, okay, now we're returning and we're phasing people back into work, and they refuse. We keep all that type of documentation that says, yes, we called them and we gave them this offer letter, or we recalled them back to work, and here's all the documentation that says that they refused. There's legal answers to these questions that, if they are not fulfilling the essential job functions, and then there's also the morale questions. So again, having these conversations with people, figuring out what's best for their particular scenario, and deciding whether or not you need to part ways with the employees if they refuse to return to work.
Okay, thank you. My next question is, what do you do if a part-time employee refuses to come back to work because he or she is making more on unemployment?
Again, this is a tough situation for employers to be in, but hopefully we're educating our employees here. And if they refuse to come back to work, their job loss due to a termination could technically have their unemployment, they would be disqualified for unemployment. So again, it's that, is the employee available for work and they refused work? When we as employers get those unemployment sheets that we have to fill out and we say that they refused work, that should disqualify them from unemployment. Sometimes the employer certainly has leverage of being, if there's full-time status, you get benefits for that. We're trying to educate our employees to tell them, listen, it's better for you to have this job now, and you have your full-time health benefits, you have all of these things that come along with it. We understand that curveball with making more on unemployment was thrown at us, but you have to explain to the employees that just because you're making more on unemployment right now doesn't mean that that's going to continue. And when you're ready to come back, your job may no longer be available. So it's coaching your employees and trying to get them to take the least amount of risk right now, and sticking with you in longevity, and saying, hey, these are all the benefits that you get with us. Health benefits, that's where the employer certainly has leverage in that type of scenario.
Okay. My next question is, should an employer be concerned about the long-term effects as they make all these changes and the effects on their workforce? Should they be concerned about the long-term effects of unemployment insurance rate increases?
There's a lot of question around what is going to happen with unemployment and with rates, and how they're going to look at that in the future, and are employers really going to get pinged with these higher rates? My answer to that is, I often advise my clients that the immediate decision to terminate often outweighs the long-term effects of a rate increase, because if that person, let's say, is a toxic employee, or is someone that you're better off terminating them, I wouldn't worry about the rates, because there's just too much unknown with unemployment right now that we don't know what they're going to do down the pike here once people return back to work.
Okay. My next question is, do you have any general HR suggestions for managing a remote workforce?
Again, it's been very difficult right now. And Rick kind of touched on this piece about communication earlier. So communication, as we know, it has completely changed. So we're doing a lot of our communicating via Zoom or via email. I know I feel like I get double the amount of emails right now. But what I like to remind people that when people are remote, when their employees are remote, you lose a lot of that organic conversation and water cooler talk and all those types of things. So you have to be a lot more intentional about your communication. So you have to schedule certain meetings, whether that be weekly check-ins with people or daily check-ins with your team. You have to be very deliberate about these things, because before, people would just stop by and they would knock on your door, or you'd see them in passing and say, oh yeah, by the way, we need to talk about X, Y, or Z. So now we just have to be a lot more intentional. The other thing that I try to remind people about communicating in general is just that you lose a lot when you just communicate via, let's say, text or email. You lose a lot of the communication through that. So you lose your tone and you lose your facial expressions. So please keep that in mind when you're delivering certain messages or certain information. Know the difference between what conversation should be had over phone, over Zoom, or what can just constitute a quick text or Teams message or email. Know the difference between what constitutes what. And then, of course, just clearly communicating expectations for remote work. If we're not being proactive about our communication, and especially towards the people that we manage, they're going to make assumptions sometimes that are completely wrong, and we have no way of knowing that. So clearly communicate your expectations for them, their responsibilities, what you're looking for. And I think really these times have forced us all to be a lot better communicators.
Okay, thank you. So now we're going to dive into our last topic, which is looking at some special considerations for larger employers. And when I say larger, I'm talking about employers with over 50 employees. So Maria, could you dive in just for some special considerations that those types of employers should be thinking about right now?
Right. So there's one main law. It's called the WARN Act, and that's what I want people to be aware of. That's really has to do with companies with 50 or more employees in a single site laying off a good amount of their employees. Let's say they're closing. You have to give 60-day notice if you're going to be closing a certain site. So that is there's state-specific WARN laws, and then I believe there's also a federal WARN law as well. But if you are considering doing mass layoffs, please check the state WARN requirements and figure out what type of notice you have to give, how you have to offboard those people, some of the things that Rick talked about earlier, whether that's, again, proper notice with benefits, transitioning health benefits, things of that sort. So check out what you need, what your obligations are under WARN. The second thing that I like to keep in mind for everybody is that even though we're in a pandemic, when all we see and live and breathe is COVID, please don't forget that we have other compliance requirements. Especially under the Delaware state law, we have our sexual harassment training requirements. So 2021 comes up as a retraining year for us, because in Delaware, we're supposed to train our workforces with 50 or more employees on sexual harassment every 2 years. So please don't forget that we still have to do our sexual harassment training. That may look differently, of course, now. Maybe you're going to do online training. Of course, that fulfills the interactive requirements that meet the law. Maybe you're going to do Zoom. You're going to do a live presentation from somebody via Zoom. However you're going to do that, please don't forget that we still need to do it, even though most of our workforce is remote. Also, we're waiting on some guidance from the federal level on things like EEO-1 reports. EEO-2 pay data, of course, I believe that remains a question mark right now as to whether or not we have to compile that data. But if you're over 100 employees, you are required to submit your EEO reports. So please keep that in mind. And then there's other benefits and tax requirements as well, ERISA requirements, 1095s under ACA, filing 5500s if you meet those certain threshold requirements. Please don't forget that we still have compliance requirements as HR professionals. And I know we have enough on our plate with figuring out how to transition our workforce back, or whether we're going remote fully from now on. Please don't forget that we have compliance requirements as well.
Okay, thank you. This concludes video 3 of our interview series. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in, and I really want to thank our experts as well for their time today. You can learn more about the Delaware SBDC at delawaresbdc.org. You can learn more about Maria at bhi365.com. That's bhi365.com. And more about Rick at acuteconsulting.net. That's acuteconsulting.net. Again, thank you for tuning in to video 3 of our content series. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anthony. Thanks, Maria.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Thank you for watching. The Delaware SBDC provides one-on-one, free, and confidential business advising. Contact us and schedule a meeting today.